Okay, so in this edition of TextMax Happy Embroidery Machine webinars, this topic is going to be about the setting menu and additional functions that an embroiderer who's already familiar with the basic operations of your Happy Embroidery Machine may want to know that will give them a little bit more capability. So some of those are conveniently summarized in one place in your machine in what's called the settings menu. This is not just in the current touchscreen machines. If you happen to be watching this and you have the larger color control panel that is actually a little bit wider than this, if you can see my hands, it's a little bit wider, about 9 inches. So this is about a 5.5 or a 7-inch diagonal control panel. The other one's a 9-inch, it's a little bit longer. But all of them have the same function, which is called setting. So from the beginning, when you start your Happy Embroidery Machine, and I'm not going to be specific about which model this is going to be identical even on the multi-head machines. On initial boot up, you want to go from your boot screen or splash screen and tells you to go next, and then you're finally in the home screen, or what Happy formally calls the drive screen. Okay, so and that should be coming up any second now. Okay, so in the drive screen here, this is where you actually start and operate your machine, but this is also your jumping off point to other areas in the menu. Bottom right corner, go to the main menu and look for an option of submenu items in here called setting. In the touchscreen machines, it's the upper right corner. And then you have a series of sub pages too as well. You can see this red square highlights that we're on the first sub page, and then the second sub page, and then third and fourth. Okay, in order, following these, the first one is just general settings and adjustments that are probably the most useful and the most common. So that's a good move on Happy's part, is they put the most common adjustments on the default screen. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I kind of ignore the rest of these. They aren't used very often, but I will gloss on them. The second set of settings is for repeat. If you saw on our YouTube channel, we have a video on how to use the auto repeat function so that you can copy, for example, this outline here is the current design, and you can make number of rows and columns, which are these values, and then make for multiple copies within the same hoop. Then the third one is offset, and the offset lets you sew off from from somewhere other than center. And then the fourth one is frame out. So you can program a frame out in a not only at a particular color change, which is here. So you can set, or actually you can manually set your frame out to whatever that is, and then whatever that distance is. So you can get it to come all the way out or partially way out, or you can set it manually here. So that's kind of what that is. Honestly, frame out can be set in the color screen. It's a little bit easier. So we don't have that much documented use for it in this screen. And again, offset can also be done in other screens. So going backwards toward the most important screen, finally, again, auto repeat. If you're interested in patches, we do have a separate video on how to do multiples in the same hoop using this feature. So also, let's go to the most important screen here, or the most commonly used screen, and again, the default screen, which is general settings. So this becomes basically 3 separate short lessons. The first 2 blocks are resizing. So the resizing, you can see that we've got 2 values of 100. The first value of 100 is the X value, or the width. So for example, if I want to make the design so a smidge smaller, like maybe 10% smaller than type in 90, and that shrinks the width by 10%. And then always, as you may guess, take the second value, which is the height, the Y value, and also change it to the same value. That way it doesn't get stretched. So, so that it just shrinks in proportion. So also do 90 and 90, or 90 and 90 makes both the width and the height 10% smaller. So that's how that works. And what's really neat is that when you do the numbers up here, which are the size in either millimeters or inches, that one happens to be in millimeters, that can also be changed. Those change to show the new size. And also when you go back to your hoop picture, you'll see that it's actually smaller in the hoop. Okay, so that's very, very useful for small resizes. The official, without going to the depth of the conversation here, of this particular topic, resizing designs, which is a common thing. Happy machines currently do not recalculate the stitch count when you shrink the design or increase its size. Normally it should, but embroidery designs are generally flexible enough that you can size them up and down a little bit. The official safe recommendation is no more than about 10%. So try not to do anything higher than 110% and anything smaller than 90%. You can do it smaller if you want to. You just run into increasing risks. So there are other technical details on that. But just one common use for this is, for example, you needed a design to fit in a certain small hoop, like the 12-centimeter round hoop, and it barely doesn't fit. Shrink it here. That way you don't have to go back and edit it or wait for a digitizer. You can do it while you're in the machine, so you don't have to go anywhere else. Okay. I'm going to skip the next one because the next one is the biggest one. And coming from my perspective as a 22-year digitizer, this one is huge. It talks about quality and everything. It's a simple setting, and I'll tell you something, I use it all the time. So I will talk to that next, satin pull compensation. But first, a very simple one. These last two are basically rotation. The first one is rotation by degree. So for example, if you need something rotated, a live example may be that if you've ever monogrammed a fleece blanket, the convention is that you rotate it 45 degrees outwards towards the corner. So if you want to rotate something 45 degrees, now watch this rectangle here. See how it looks straight up and down? If I rotate this 45 degrees, it's set. You can see the rectangle is rotated. Well, I did 12. Let's try that again. Clear, 45, set. You can see that the rectangle is now rotated 45 degrees. So you can either rotate by degree, or, and I'm going to set that back to 0. Just clear that. Well, let's try that again, 0. And then the other one is rotate in increments of 90 degrees. And by doing that, look at the orientation of the letter P, which stands for pattern. If you press this button, you see different P's at different orientations. So the way the P is rotated on that button is what the machine's going to do to the design. So if I just want to turn it upside down, look for an upside down P, which happens to look like a lowercase d, press that. And you can see that, for example, the flower that we were looking at earlier, it's rotated in 180 degrees. So going back to setting, so the orientation of the P is the orientation of the design. And the reason I'm repeating that is because you've got 4 common rotations, which is right side up, rotated 90 degrees, 180, and 270 degrees. But then also the second row are mirrored positions. So a backwards P, all of these are the same rotation, but also mirrored. So just like you would look at the word ambulance in the front on the front of an ambulance is backwards, so you can see that in your rear view mirror. It's exactly the same idea. This is mirrored in case you want to mirror a copy of the design. Okay. All right, and again, saving the best for last, I want to talk about, this is what's called satin pull compensation. And what satin pull compensation is basically, very simply said, it bold faces the satin stitches in a design. And what that means is, if I can go to the machine's pattern library here, and let's pick a different kinds of designs, that there are different designs can be made up of different kinds of stitching. So kind of going through this particular machine's pattern library, you may have the more detailed stitches here. If I can look through this one's a monogram collection. But for example, this is a logo here, and if I look at that close up, this has satin and fill stitches in it. The lettering is satin stitches, the border is satin stitches, but the background circular yellow fill is what's called a fill stitch. So when you go into setting and increase your satin pull compensation, it's going to boldface only the satin stitch and leave that fill stitch the same size. Boldfacing means it'll just make it wider along the angle of the stitch. What's really important about this is that when you're sewing small detail, for example, small lettering, it tends to get lost in thick items or stretchy items. And if, of course, if you have a combination of both, like a hoodie, it gets really lost. And sometimes even just a conventional item, like a golf shirt, an Oxford shirt, sometimes your satin stems are too thin. So that's a mistake of amateur digitizers, or maybe you're just new to lettering and doing it yourself. So when your satin stems or borders, like you saw, I'll escape back out here just talking about this. So if you're either your text or the border sews too thin, and what happens is that either it's too thin and the edges look ragged, or even if you have a nice robustly thick border like this here, and you see a gap, for example, between the fill stitch and the satin stitch, it's usually because they pull away from each other. But satin stitches tend to shrink more. So that's why satin pull compensation is important. Even thinner satin stitches that are real thin, they get lost much more easily than this nice thick border, but they all lose. So if this one loses enough, you can potentially see a gap where that yellow meets the blue. So if you're sewing on something thick or stretchy and you're not sure how good the digitizer is, or you just actually happen to have that problem, you can always back up, go here, and increase the value by typically 0.2 or 0.4. You can actually go up to 1.0 millimeters, which makes that satin really, really bold. But try 0.2. It's set, and you may not see it right away, but this satin border is now 0.2 of a millimeter wider to, again, compensate for the loss in width due to stretch or thickness. That happens all the time in embroidery. So that's why that is so important for you to be able to do that. So, and in fact, it's such an important setting that I'll tell you something. There are a lot of experienced, happy embroidery machine operators that we go out to on site, and they have a lot of bad small lettering or bad tiny designs, or they're sewing a lot of thick things. They permanently set their machines to always sew 0.2 millimeter pull compensation. That's another location that I will show you immediately after this. But I should back up and tell you that this setting here, everything in this screen affects only the currently selected design. And it also will remember this, any of these changes, as long as the design is saved in the control panel. In fact, if you save it back off of the control panel, the machine will actually write a little tiny file called an HP1 file that'll remember it on your USB stick as well if you need to move it off the machine. But it's important to know that everything done in the setting file is saved with that machine. And so Christy asked here a good question. Use this on thick and or stretchy items? Excellent question. Yes. I would absolutely do that. Anything that's thick or anything that's stretching, if you haven't touched your design and for example, the worst case scenario, your customer gave you a $75 shirt and then they only want one of them and you don't have a chance to test it out, put on 0.2 millimeter pull compensation. It will bias it towards sewing better. Things will look a little bit richer. And most importantly, if you have satin stitches that are too tiny, again, that's another technical discussion, but if they're too tiny, too thin, this will get that out of the danger zone for most of them. So excellent question. And then also on top of that, your question is used on thick and or stretchy items. To build on that, also use it if you have tiny lettering that doesn't sew out very well. And what's really good about the satin pull compensation setting is that you can have it sew out really badly and watch it. And if it doesn't sew out well, back up your sewing position with your minus button until you're right before that. Turn this on, and it'll sew right on top of that. And because it's wider, it'll cover up the bad sew out. So useful. I will tell you something. It saves me on every other design that I sew on. And I'm an experienced digitizer. Sometimes digitizers normally know to boldface satin stitches, especially on hats. You're going to see that The hat lettering, small lettering on hats is much more bold than it really is supposed to look when you look at it on screen, but it shows just fine on the hat itself. That's because the digitizer knows to actually build this in so you don't have to do this. But it's impossible for a digitizer, no matter how good they are, to guess the exact amount until they send this out on the actual garment. So this gives you some room and coverage for you to make the adjustment on site. So really big. Satin pull compensation, it only affects the satin stitches in the design, but the most important thing is it also affects all satin stitches on the design. So excellent question. And so that concludes this particular section.